Hi, my name's Hugo, and this is the fourth episode of my series All Under Heaven on classical China. This episode is about the reign of Liu Bang, better known as Emperor Gaozu or Gaodi. Last week, we finished up with Liu Bang's victory over Xiang Yu and his ascension to the position of emperor. In this episode, we'll talk about his reign, some of the major events, the institutions he created, and his style of leadership. By the way, from now on, I'm usually going to refer to him by his posthumous titles, Gaozu and Gaodi, meaning High Ancestor and High Emperor, or simply as the Emperor. And like last time, if I quote an historical person saying something, the quote will be from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian. I'll make sure to clarify if I'm quoting from another source, such as Ban Gu's Book of Han. So, how do you go about governing such a vast country as China? Gaozu and his chancellor, Xiao He, had two key models to look back on from the past: the feudalistic, decentralized model of Zhou, and the totalitarian, centralized model of Qin. I'm going to call the former the feudal model, and the latter the imperial model. The Zhou were the dynasty that preceded the divided China of the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods. In this model, the king only ruled a small territory directly. Much of the rest of China was granted as fiefs to followers and members of the royal family, for them and their ancestors to rule as their own miniature kingdoms. So long as these nobles remained loyal to the central ruler, things worked out all right. Thus, the feudal model was an idealistic one. Its survival was based on an assumption of goodwill between the ruler and his nobles. It also appealed on an emotional level to much of the elite population. This was the sort of governing style that had been praised by Confucius, and the early Zhou period was considered a golden age. Furthermore, men who achieved positions of rank expected rewards of fiefdoms from the ruler. To call it idealistic is not to say that it had no practical advantages. If you remember from the last episode, when Zhang Liang persuaded Gaozu to make some of his generals into kings, he argued that these generals would be more willing to fight for Liu if they got some real benefit out of it: land and titles. Feudal lords would be motivated to defend and develop their lands because their wealth was derived from them. When Liu had defeated Xiang Yu, these same generals asked Liu to become emperor because it would legitimize the titles he had given them. However, history had shown the problems of the feudal model. In the case of Zhou, the power of the central state relative to the subordinate kingdoms had decreased over time. Eventually, Zhou could claim its position of supremacy in name only, and was unable to force its will on the other states. When a fiefdom was first established under Zhou, there might be personal friendship between the fiefholder and the king of Zhou, which dissuaded any thoughts of rebellion. However, when you went several generations down the line, and it was the great-grandson of that fiefholder dealing with the great-grandson of that king, the personal relationship probably did not exist. Even the war that Liu Bang had just won was an example of another disadvantage. The system Xiang Yu had implemented after the defeat of Qin was a version of the feudal model. He himself had the position of king protector, while there were 18 other kings who were meant to remain loyal to him. However, because of this passing out of power, when Liu Bang rebelled, other kings were able to go over to his side, and Xiang soon found himself fighting with half of China, not just a single rebellious kingdom. The imperial model, the Qin model, seemed to cover some of these weaknesses in the feudal model. Rather than dividing China into kingdoms, the country was divided into commanderies. It had rejected feudalism. People were granted noble titles very rarely, and even when they did, it only entitled them to tax revenue from a certain area, not political control, and the title did not pass down to the nobles' children. Commanderies were not run by a hereditary monarch, rather by a governor appointed by the emperor. Commanderies were further divided into counties, which were run by magistrates also appointed by the emperor. The fact that these positions were centrally appointed, rather than hereditary, made it easier for an emperor to handle a subordinate who was being rebellious. He could just be dismissed and replaced. Furthermore, their income was dependent on the taxes collected by the central government, not from the produce of the commandery. Thus, the interests of these bureaucrats was more likely to be in line with the interests of the emperor. However, its disadvantage lay in its centralization. The limited powers of a governor in his commandery, compared to a semi-independent king in his kingdom, made it more difficult for him to respond to local crises. When the revolt against Qin started, much of the early success was due to commanderies being unable to effectively combat the rebels. It was also a lot of work for the emperor and his ministers to monitor all these commanderies and counties, and it demanded a huge bureaucracy, and in a time when most of the population was illiterate, and without institutions set up to train people for civic work, there might simply not be enough competent men to staff all the necessary positions if commanderies and counties were to be implemented throughout the empire. I've set out the models here as if they were items on a menu, but the reality was that when Liu Bang became the emperor, he and his chancellor Xiao He weren't working with a blank slate, free to pick and choose elements from each system as they saw fit. The country they were dealing with had already been politically morphed by the war. As Liu's armies had marched out of the southwest corner of China, many of the lands they had conquered were organized into commanderies, suggesting that Liu found the centralization of the imperial model appealing. At the end of the war, 13 commanderies had been established, mainly in the Guangdong area, the region in the west secured by the Qinling Mountains and the Yellow River, which Liu had won control of early in the war. However, other areas had been granted as kingdoms to some of Liu Bang's followers in order to keep them on side during the war. Notably, there was Qi, which had been granted to Hansen, Zhao, which had been granted to Zhang Er, and was now held by his son Zhang Ao, and Huanan, which had been granted to Qingbu. Now that he had become emperor, Liu could hardly revoke these crowns without turning the men who had won the empire for him into powerful enemies. So the compromise system that Liu and Xiao produced was arrived at not so much through deliberation on what would work in the long term, but through political necessity. Alongside the 13 commanderies, 7 kingdoms were confirmed at the onset of Liu's rule. They were all granted to men who had served Liu during the war. For now, none of them were members of the Liu family. I'll just mention a few of them who we've already met. 2 of the men whom I mentioned, Zhang Ao and Qingbu, retained their kingdoms. Hansen was made the king of Chu rather than Qi, because he was familiar with the culture of Chu. Peng Yue, Liu's general who had doggedly raided enemy supply routes in the region of Liang throughout the war, was made king of that region. The eastern portion of the empire was mainly under the jurisdiction of kings, and the western under the emperor and his governors. All in all, the kingdoms comprised about 2/3 of the landmass of the empire, and a greater portion of the population. The kings were generally free to appoint their own ministers, and the internal affairs of their kingdoms were largely up to them. This had its administrative advantages. It was an efficient way for the emperor to rule large areas of land, without having to burden the central government with fiddly local decisions. But each kingdom was large enough to be powerful on its own. The potential of these kingdoms to break away and threaten the empire was a danger Liu tried to mitigate until the end of his reign. From the onset, there were legal restrictions placed on what a king was allowed to do. Most notably, while they were responsible for training armed forces, they were not allowed to mobilize without permission from the emperor. Furthermore, they were obliged to pay an annual tribute to the emperor and report on the state of their kingdom. The chancellors of the kingdoms were also usually appointed by the central government, and could keep an eye on the king and protect the interests of the emperor. Commanderies and kingdoms had subunits within them. The commanderies were divided into counties run by magistrates, as they had been under Qin. There were also marquisates, which were present in both commanderies and kingdoms. To be made a marquis was to be made a noble, and in terms of rewards from the emperor, it was second only to being made king. Marquises were responsible for collecting taxes in their marquisate, and were entitled to a portion of the tax they collected. They did not necessarily own the land of their marquisate, though. Unlike the marquisates of Qin, the title and benefits were passed down from father to son. Marquisates were a useful tool for rewarding loyal subjects and members of the imperial clan, and were an efficient way of deepening the tentacles of imperial power. By 195 BC, the end of Liu's reign, there were nearly 150 marquisates throughout China. The presence of hereditary kingdoms and marquisates, alongside commanderies and counties, was the greatest departure from the example set by the Qin Empire. In many other things, though, Han followed Qin more closely. Positions in the central government were copied from Qin. There were 12 important positions in the government, comprised of 3 senior statesmen and 9 other ministers. The 3 statesmen were the Chancellor, the most important official, responsible for much of the administration, the Imperial Councillor, who acted as a check on the Chancellor and as a sort of advisor to the Emperor, and the Supreme Commander, who was like a commander-in-chief, responsible for military affairs. When Liu became emperor, the men in these offices had all attained them during the war against Xiang Yu. The Chancellor was Xiao He, who had been in charge of the Guangdong region during the war, and had saved Liu's campaign several times by conscripting fresh men and mobilizing the economy. The Imperial Councillor was Zhou Chang, a man known for his uprightness, and the Supreme Commander was Lu Wan, who had served Liu in commanding the armies during the war. All these men were natives of Pei, the same region where Liu had been born, and Lu Wan in particular was a close childhood friend of Liu's. The 9 ministers had more specific duties. They were kind of like members of cabinet, responsible for specific departments of government. It'd be tedious to go through all of the officers and describe their roles now, so we won't. On the provincial level, commanderies retained the positions of civil governor and military commandant that had been present under Qin, but did away with the position of inspector, who had acted as the emperor's representative. Perhaps it was felt that with less commanderies, 13 instead of 36, the need for this extra supervision was diminished. As for the kingdoms, each king was served by his own miniature replica of the central government, with power to appoint and dismiss most of his ministers as he chose. A notable feature of Han officers was their overlapping responsibilities, which acted as a sort of checks and balances system. For important areas of government, 2 men usually had ultimate say. This was to prevent one man from single-handedly steering policy in his own interests. I already mentioned that the Imperial Council acted as a check on the Chancellor. They shared responsibility for promulgating orders down the administrative chain, and while the Chancellor could make executive orders, the Imperial Councillor had to approve them. Among the 9 ministers, the superintendents of agriculture and the lesser treasury shared responsibility for finance and the economy, with different streams of revenue going to each department. The superintendent of agriculture mainly being concerned with public expenses, and the superintendent of the lesser treasury being concerned with palace expenses. The superintendent of trials was in most cases the supreme judge for criminal trials, but in cases from counties with imperial tombs, the superintendent of ceremonial was the supreme judge, and for cases involving high officials, a subordinate of the chancellor had jurisdiction. In the military, commands are often held by an officer of the left and an officer of the right, and multiple generals might be assigned to command one army in a campaign. Han preferred to guard against the possibility of a single general with a loyal army turn against the empire, even if it meant compromise the effectiveness of command in the field. I should note that the business of translating these officers into English is a complicated one. There are a few different systems used, and I'm trying to stick to Michael Lowe's system from the Cambridge History of China. However, the translations from the various primary sources I'm using use different systems, so for important officers like the Chancellor and the Imperial Councillor, I'll mention Lowe's equivalent as well. When Liu had first conquered, or perhaps he would say liberated, the Guangdong region from Qin, he had issued a proclamation to the population, sympathising with how they had suffered under the harsh laws of their rulers, and promising them a simpler 3-article law code: death for murderers, punishment for injurers and thieves according to the severity of their crime, and abolishment of all other Qin laws. An edict he issued, after becoming emperor, may have been another example of anti-Qin rhetoric when it came to law. The edict referred to people who had taken refuge in the wilderness to escape the violence of the war between Shu and Han. According to the Book of Han, the edict said, "The officials, using civil laws, should teach and instruct these people. Let it be published abroad that there is to be no beating or shaming of them." And this seems to be in line with the attitude of the Confucian scholar Sun Quan, who believed that the role of the government was to instruct people to be moral. The legalist philosophy that Qin had extolled, on the other hand, was fond of punishment, and was more aimed at scaring the population into submission rather than raising them to be virtuous. In 200 BC, Xiaohe was put in charge of consolidating the law code. Despite the previous proclamations, though, the code was not revolutionary. It built on Qin law, adding 3 more chapters to the 6 of the Qin code. And to be fair, the idea that you could govern an empire with just 3 articles of law, as Liu had announced with his intention when he conquered Guangzhong, was probably a bit idealistic. The limited evidence that we have suggests that as far as the legal code went, the transition from Qin to Han was marked more by continuity than change. How then do we account for the traditional image of Qin law being so tyrannical, while Han being so benevolent? Part of it is propaganda. The rebels who overthrew Qin and eventually established their own dynasty wanted to make their enemy look as bad as possible, so as to legitimize their own rule. But according to the Book of Han, Liu Bang might have earned his reputation as a generous ruler as well. Even if the legal code itself did not change much from Qin to Han, Liu was very forgiving as an emperor. He issued 3 general amnesties throughout his reign, clearing people charged with crimes, unless it was a crime that warranted the death penalty, such as murder or incest. In addition, he made several amnesties forgiving specific groups of people, such as in the autumn of 199 BC, when he pardoned officials who had committed crimes that had not yet been discovered, and in the winter of 198-7, when he issued the same sort of pardon to the citizens of Yueyang, to mark the death of his father. In addition to amnesties for criminal charges, there were several occasions where people were rewarded with exemptions from corvée labour and taxes. In the summer of 202, shortly after the victory had been achieved, and the armies were going home, members of the families of the new kings, who decided to stay in Guangzhong, the area controlled directly by the emperor, were given an exemption of 12 years, while those who decided to go to the kingdoms were given an exemption of 6. In the spring of 199, soldiers and officers who fought at a particular battle were given an exemption for life. This generosity contrasted with the reign of the Qin emperors, who used massive amounts of corvée, conscript and convict labourers in their construction projects, and had used exemptions sparingly, usually as compensation for people who had been relocated to colonise a new area. There's also the matter of the Orders of Honour. I might have mentioned them briefly before. They were a system created in Qin during the Warring States era, which were an important instrument for the governing philosophy of reward and punishment. By the time of the Qin Empire, there were 20 ranks, and they carried material benefits such as land, exemptions from various obligations, and access to government jobs. Han inherited this 20-rank system, though he used it in a slightly different manner. In Qin, ranks had strictly been granted just to reward good behaviour, mainly military accomplishments and donations to the government. However, Gaodi started to grant them to huge swaths of the population. Sometimes it was to a particular subsection, like in 195, when they were offered to anyone from the Kingdom of Yan who remained loyal to the Han government following a rebellion in that region, and sometimes to the whole population, like when Gaozu first acceded to the throne in 202. Such general bestowals became a common feature of Han government, to celebrate or otherwise mark important occasions, or as a tool in dealing with some local issue. The rewards attached to the ranks themselves were made more desirable. Under Qin, only the highest of the ranks, the marquises, were entitled to tax revenue from estates worked by others. Under Gaodi, the highest 7 ranks were given such estates. Other privileges were also extended, with more ranks being exempt from the poll tax, labour, and military service. This was a great way of keeping those who had come to prominence and received ranks in the years of the war after the fall of Qin happy. Even outside the rank system, every household was granted about 10 acres of land, which was a good way of bringing as much land as possible under cultivation, as well as probably making Gaodi a pretty popular emperor. Another way in which Liu followed Qin was in religious matters. When Qin had united China, the most important religious ceremony that the emperors performed was something Qin rulers had been doing since the Warring States period: the worship of directional coloured deities, known as the Di. The way that the directions and colours were linked was connected to the 5 phases theory, which I talked a bit about in episode 2, It basically organised all sorts of things, like seasons, elements, colours, and even musical notes, into 5 categories, and different Chinese dynasties were supposed to have ruled according to one particular element. Zhou was described as having ruled by the power of fire, in this case more of a post hoc idea, and Qin claimed to have ruled by the power of water. Qin had worshipped 4D, the green D of the east, the red D of the south, the yellow D of the centre, and the white one of the west. Liu had begun to worship these D in 205, when he was still embroiled in the civil war, before he even became emperor. To this pantheon, he added the 5th D, the black one from the north. Scholars have interpreted different motives behind this move. Mark Edward Lewis argues that it was a way for Liu to make his claim to the whole earth. Michael Lowe says that it was to ensure that all the 5 powers were satisfied, and was also a way to announce continuity with Qin. Black was a correlate of water, the same power that Qin had claimed to govern by. Indeed, Liu himself made no declaration that a new phase of the 5 phases had started alongside the new dynasty. It was not until nearly 100 years later that a Han emperor made such a claim. Another vein in which Liu followed Qin was in how he justified his rule. If you remember from episode 2, the first emperor set up all sorts of stone inscriptions around China, proclaiming his achievements. He claimed for himself the role of the virtuous conqueror. He had marched out from Qin to punish the wicked kings of the other warring states, and had brought peace and order to the common people. For the sake of comparison, here's the text of one of these stone inscriptions, which I quoted last episode. He called out his armies to punish the unprincipled, and the workers of evil have been wiped clean. His arms cut down the violent and contentious, his civil arts restored the guiltless, and the hearts of the multitude are submissive. Generously he judged merit and worth, his rewards extending to oxen and horses, and his bounty fattened the land. The august emperor displayed his might. His virtue brought together the feudal lords, for the first time bestowing unity and peace. He demolished walls and fortifications, opened up waterways, cut through embankments, and levelled the steep declivities. When the shape of the land had been fixed, the masses were freed from corvée labour, and all the empire was comforted. Now men delight in their tasks, women pursue their occupations, each affair arranged in the proper order. His bounty extends to every occupation. All have their allotted work in the fields, none without a place of rest. The host of officials praises his magnificence, begging leave to inscribe this stone, that his example may be made known to future ages. And here's the speech said to have been made by Liu's followers, begging him to become emperor. There are some clear similarities, but it also makes some different justifications. It's quoted in the Book of Han. You, great king, arose from small beginnings. You destroyed the seditious dynasty of Qin. Your majesty stirs everything within the seas. Moreover, starting from a secluded and mean region, from Hanzhong, you acted out your majesty in virtue, executing the unrighteous, setting up the meritorious, tranquilizing and establishing the empire. Meritorious officials all received territory and the income of towns. You did not appropriate them for yourself. Your virtue, great king, has been bestowed, even to the borders of the 4 seas. We, vassal kings, find our speech inadequate to express it. For you to take the position of emperor would be most appropriate. We hope that you, great king, will favour the world by doing so. In common, there's the righteous military action. But in the first emperor's inscription, it was against the unprincipled warring states, while in the speech of the vassal kings, it was against the seditious Qin. They both talk about punishing the wicked and rewarding the good. They both talk about the ruler's generosity, although here's where the difference lies, because they mean very different things. The first emperor's inscription refers to the emperor's bounty, which is somehow connected to a general economic prosperity. In the speech of the vassal kings, it's something quite specific. Liu's willingness to enfeoff his followers, the feature of his reign that was a real departure from Qin practice. There's a sense that Liu put a lot of stock in his ability to secure the loyalty of his supporters. Shortly after becoming emperor, he held a feast in the southern palace of Luoyang, where he asked his generals for their opinions on why he had triumphed over Xiang Yu. The consensus reached was that while Xiangyu had been more polite and respectful than Liu, he had been jealous of talented men and had been reluctant to reward them. Later, Liu and Hansen discussed who was the better general, and Hansen stated he thought himself a better general. If that was the case, Liu asked, why had Liu become emperor and not Han? Hansen replied, quote, "Your Majesty cannot command soldiers, but you are good at commanding generals." Another difference between the first emperor's inscription and the speech of the vassal kings is that Liu was praised for his rise to the position of emperor from humble beginnings. Liu had begun his life as a commoner, and not even a wealthy one. He had been something of a layabout and drunkard in his hometown, though he achieved the position of village head through a civil exam. In contrast, the first emperor had been born a prince and inherited the throne of an already powerful state. This difference may be important in explaining why Han was able to endure for several hundred years, while Qin lasted just 15. The rise of Liu Bang from lowly commoner to emperor was considered almost miraculous by the Chinese. Sima Chen, reflecting on the reign of Liu Bang, wrote, quote, "Why should people say that one cannot become a king unless he possesses land? Was this man not what the old books term a great sage? Surely this is the work of heaven." His humble beginnings meant that Liu's achievement could be attributed entirely to his personal virtue and competence and divine favour, rather than the position that he was born into. Somewhat contradictorily, these qualities were thought to be inherited in some way by Liu's descendants, imbuing the Han dynasty with a sense of potent legitimacy. Historian Mark M. Lewis points to another way his humble beginnings aided him. It meant he was not strongly connected to a pre-existing political unit. He wasn't tied down to any particular locale. He was born in a town in Chu, but had launched his campaign against Xiangyu from a much different location, the remote Sichuan Basin, and after he became emperor he made his base in Guangzhong. In contrast, Emperor Zheng had begun as the monarch of Qin, and had marched out from Qin to conquer other states, and after his conquests ruled them from the capital of Qin. In episode 2, I talked about how the Qin dynasty was never really able to create the feeling that it was anything more than one nation that had defeated and now ruled several others. Due in part to Liu's lowly origin and disconnect from particular nations, he was able to avoid that feeling. The Han dynasty ruled China not as a victor state over vanquished ones, but as a family that brought no historical baggage, and through its virtue united the country. So, that's some of the more abstract and background discussions surrounding the beginning of Han out of the way. While they attacked the Qin and the first emperor as tyrannical and wicked, in significant ways Liu imitated Qin practice, in administration, law and religion. In these first two domains in particular, Qin had provided the model of imperial government. Its failure lay more in the policies it had pursued, massive frontiers wars and laborious construction projects, in the nature of its claim to authority, in the incompetence of the second emperor, and in the totality and speed with which the model had been implemented, than in the model itself. The legalist philosophy that had guided the first emperor, and his chancellor Li Si, however despised it was by traditional historians, was at its heart pragmatic, and the concepts introduced into Chinese thought were essential in the governance of the empire throughout its history: rule by law, meritocracy, and rational consequence-focused analysis of policy. It survived in spirit, though not in name. We'll talk about it more in later episodes. For now, though, we'll get into the events of the rest of Liu Bang's reign. Rather than going year by year, as I did with the Qin, I'm going to approach these events in three broader topics: the establishment of the imperial capital, the invasion of the Xiongnu, and the revolts of the vassal kings. These three processes were all happening at the same time, and I think it'll be clearer to discuss them by topic rather than by chronology. The first major event to take place after Liu's assumption of the throne was the relocation of the capital. After his victory over Xiangyu, Liu Bang had made his capital at Luoyang, a city on the Yellow River in central China, outside of the passes. Liu had chosen it for ideological reasons. It was supposed to be the centre of the world, and had been the capital of the Eastern Zhou dynasty. Making it the seat of the empire was a symbolic declaration of a return to the supposedly virtuous government of Zhou. However, a man called Lord Jing sought audience with the emperor, and advised him to move his capital to a city in the secure Guangdong area. Unlike Zhou, he argued, Liu had won the empire through warfare, and thus needed to be prepared for more conflict. He should instead follow the example of Qin, which had been served well by its strategic location within the passes. Liu consulted with Zhang Liang, who agreed with Law. Thus, he founded the city of Chang'an, just a few kilometers east of the old Qin capital in Xianyang. From there on, it grew to become one of the great cities of the ancient world. Liu used the former Qin outskirt palace, the Single, to make his new Changle palace. Changle can be translated as lasting joy. However, he soon began construction on a new, larger palace, the Wei Yang, or Never-Ending, as well as several other important buildings, including an armory, a granary, and a market. These projects ended up being supervised by the Chancellor Xiao He, because the emperor spent much of his reign away from the capital, engaged in military conflicts. In the spring of 200 BC, Liu paid a visit to Chang'an, after a difficult campaign against the Xiongnu. He was surprised to see how impressively the projects were turning out, but rather than being pleased, he was actually angry. He accused Xiao He of wasting money on making the city excessively grand, at a time when the empire was in difficulty. Xiao He replied, quote, "It is precisely because the fate of the empire is still uncertain that we must build such palaces and halls. A true son of heaven takes the whole world within the 4 seas to be his family. If he does not dwell in magnificence and beauty, he will have no way to manifest his authority, nor will he leave any foundation for his heirs to build upon." The argument persuaded Liu, and he was happy for the construction to continue. Historian Michael Nyland elaborates a bit more on Xiao's idea. When we think of ancient world empires, we usually take Rome as our model, and in the Roman Empire, at the height of its power, there was no city under its control, except perhaps Alexandria, that could compare to Rome itself in terms of wealth, population, and prestige. The marble city stood in the centre of the empire, its glory radiating throughout the Mediterranean, and impressing enduring admiration from all quarters. But the situation in China was different. At the onset of Han, there were several cities that were more populous, more wealthy, and had richer histories than Chang'an. Luoyang, the old capital of Zhou, Linzi, the old capital of the kingdom of Qi, Handan, Chengdu, and of course Xianyang, the capital of Qin, though its grandeur had been reduced when it had been torched by Xiangyu. From the start, the architects of Chang'an designed it in the hopes that it would eventually outshine all these cities. After all, what would the vassal kings think if, on their annual journey to visit and pay homage to the emperor, they saw that their lord lived in a city that was inferior to their own? There was one sort of building that was noticeably absent in Liu's capital, an ancestral temple. The worship of forebears was a big part of Chinese religion for eminent families, and served in part to parade their blue-blooded credentials. For the illiterate masses, it was difficult to trace one's family back more than a few generations. Royal and noble families throughout Chinese history had maintained temples to worship their patrilineal ancestors, and in fact a Warring States text, the war commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals, had defined a capital as a city with an ancestral temple. Liu, who had started off as a commoner, did not establish an ancestral temple. He probably didn't know the name of any of his forefathers older than his grandfather. In the end, though, this seeming weak point became a strength. This lack of connection to a recognised pre-imperial patriline was one of those elements that allowed Liu to claim imperial authority. The entire history of the family was one of emperors. In fact, Liu even took steps to distance himself from his own father. The fact that Liu's father was still alive, and had not himself been a monarch, created a bit of an awkward situation. Sons were supposed to show deference to their fathers, but everyone in China was meant to show deference to the emperor. So how should Liu and his father interact? After becoming emperor, Liu frequently paid visits to his father, and continued to act in the manner proper for a son. However, someone advised Liu's father not to let this go on, saying, quote, "As heaven is without 2 sons, so the earth has not 2 lords. Now although the emperor is your son, he is the ruler of men, and although you are his father, you are his subject as well. How does it happen then, that the ruler of men is doing obeisance to one of his subjects? If this is allowed to continue, the emperor's majesty will never prevail upon the world." They came to a compromise solution. His father acted deferentially to Liu, and Liu conferred upon his father the title Tai Shanghuang, Grand Supreme Emperor. There was also the legend that Liu had actually been fathered by a god, which Liu adopted as justification for not treating his human dad in the usual manner. Liu's father died in the summer of 197 BC, and Liu ordered the vassal kings build ancestral temples to him at their own capital cities. Liu did attempt to invest Chang'an with some religious significance, bringing various shamans from different regions of the empire to tend to altars set up in the capital. However, as far as major cults went, he largely followed the institutions of Qin, which meant that the most important religious sites of China, the ones where the imperial family was meant to participate, at least to some extent, in the rituals, lay outside of Chang'an. From Gaozu's reign until the time of Emperor Wu, the most important religious site was the old Qin city of Yong, which lay a few hundred kilometers west of Chang'an. This was where the sacrifice to the 5D was usually performed. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is the invasion of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu was a confederation of nomadic people who lived to the north of China. I'm going to quote the description Sima Chen gives them in the records, and even if you've just a passing interest in Eurasian history, I think you'll pick up pretty quickly what sort of people we're dealing with here. Quote, "The animals they raise consist mainly of horses, cows, and sheep, but include such rare beasts as camels, asses, mules, and the wild horses known as Taotu and Tuoji. They move about in search of water and pasture, and have no walled cities or fixed dwellings, nor do they engage in any kind of agriculture. Their lands, however, are divided into regions under the control of various leaders. They have no writing, and even promises and agreements are only verbal. The little boys start out by learning to ride sheep and shoot birds and rats with a bow and arrow, and when they get a little older, they shoot foxes and hares, which are used for food. Thus, all young men are able to use a bow and act as armed cavalry in time of war. It is their custom to herd their flocks in times of peace, and make their living by hunting, but in periods of crisis, they take up arms and go off on plundering and marauding expeditions. This seems to be their inborn nature. For long-range weapons, they use bows and arrows, and swords and spears at close range. If the battle is going well for them, they will advance, but if not, they will retreat, for they do not consider it a disgrace to run away. Their only concern is self-advantage, and they know nothing of propriety or righteousness." A biased description, to be sure, but it gives us a clear idea of the Xiongnu. They were this era's iteration of a great nomadic horse archer steppe confederacy, in the same vein as the Scythians or the Mongols. In fact, there have been theories suggesting that the descendants of the Xiongnu moved west over the course of several hundred years, where they eventually emerged in Europe and wreaked havoc as the Huns. It's an appealing idea to fans of history, but difficult to prove. Nomads had been a bother to the Chinese for centuries. If you remember from the first episode, many of the early Qin dukes spent their reigns fighting against the Rongandi people. It's believed that they introduced chariots to the Chinese, and in the 5th century BC, the king of Zhao famously started to train mounted cavalry in imitation of the nomads. However, cavalry remained a minor arm in the conflicts of the warring states, where infantry had become the predominant force on the battlefield. Historian Ralph de Sawyer estimates that the Qin army which united the empire was no more than 10% cavalry, and believes that even chariots maintained a more important role than horsemen. The Chinese horse was supposedly quite small and weak compared to the breeds that could be found on the steppe, and this may explain the slow adoption of mounted cavalry. The Xiongnu were one particular tribe of nomads living north of China. The leader of the tribe was called the Shanyu, and at the time of the Qin unification, the Shannu had been a man named Torman. If you remember, in the time of Qin, the Chinese had advanced north, with the general Meng Tian fighting the nomads and building the Great Wall. Torman had been unable to stop them. This might seem a bit unusual to us. In most cases in history, sedentary people have been at a huge disadvantage when marching into the nomads' territory. The cavalry armies of the nomads, able to live off the land, could run circles around beleaguered infantry, avoiding battles and attacking supply chains. This is just my own postulation, but I guess that the reason Meng Tian had been successful was due firstly to the manpower disparity. Sima Qian puts Meng Tian's army at 300,000, while the nomads were fighting as single tribes, not a unified confederacy. And secondly, to the makeup of the Chinese armies. While the Chinese armies of the period were infantry-based, the backbone of this infantry was heavy crossbowmen, rather than close combat troops. So even if the Chinese still had a mobility disadvantage compared to the nomads, they were probably tactically better off than European armies of the era that made similar campaigns on the other side of the steppe. When the horse archers rode up to shoot them, the Chinese could shoot back with effective firepower. Later events in Chinese history, such as the epic campaign of Li Ling deep into Xiongnu territory in 99 BC, showed that sometimes heavy archer infantry could stand up to much larger armies of horse archers. So, the barbarian tribes were pushed back north by the Chinese. With Torman unable to deal with the encroachment, it fell to his successor to react. Torman's heir was his eldest son, named Mao Dun. However, Torman's favourite was a younger son, whom he'd had with a different consort. In an effort to depose Mao Dun, so that he could make his favourite the heir, Torman sent Mao Dun as a hostage to a different tribe of nomads, the UH. He then attacked the UH, hoping that they'd kill Mao Dun in retaliation. However, Mao Dun was able to escape by stealing one of the UH's best horses and returned home. Impressed, Torman rewarded Mao Dun with the command of a force of cavalry, according to Sima, 10,000. After he received this command, Mao Dun began training an elite bodyguard. He did this by taking his men on hunting trips. Using whistling arrows, he would shoot at birds and animals, and he ordered his followers to follow his lead, and shoot at whatever target he shot at. Anyone who failed to do so he executed on the spot. Eventually, they moved on to different targets. He shot at his best horse. Those who hesitated he immediately cut down. He shot at one of his wives. Again, the men who didn't follow his example were executed. Finally, on a hunting trip, he shot at his father's best horse, and this time all his men filled the poor beast with their arrows. Now they were ready. Mao Dun took a man on a hunting trip with his father. When the time was right, he shot his father, and all of his men added their own arrows to the mess. Mao Dun went on to kill his stepmother, his brother, and all the important men who would not follow him. Thus, he claimed the position of Shan Yu for himself. As the new leader of the Xiongnu, he led a series of campaigns against other tribal people, and united them into a confederation. Firstly, he subjugated the tribes to the east. When those tribes had heard of Mao Dun's coup, they thought they might be able to intimidate him, and started making demands. Feigning weakness, he acquiesced, giving them one of his best horses, and later one of the women of his harem. But then he surprised them with an attack, killed their leaders, and brought the people under his leadership. Soon after, he defeated the UAG in the west, and the tribes to the north. The triumph of the Xiongnu was followed by a new hierarchy, which Mao Dun, as the Shan Yu, used to control his new subjects. There were lesser kings and generals under the Shan Yu, who inherited their positions and were granted land and armies by him. They were organised in a dualistic way, with the left and right Tu Chi kings, left and right Lu Li kings, and left and right Gudu marquises, and so on. Those of the left received land to the east, and were superior to those on the right, who held land in the west. The Shan Yu himself controlled the land in the centre. It was an unprecedented level of political control for the steppe people, though much less centralised and stable than the system in China. The Shan Yu had to contend with kinship and tribal loyalties, and he had to constantly prove himself in battle, and reward the other elites with bounty to maintain his position. In the words of historian Mark Edward Lewis, he was, quote, first among equals, rather than an absolute authority. Lewis also outlined some of the theories explaining the rise of the Confederacy that are less dependent on the person of Mao Dun than the story in the records. The first theory postulates that the nomadic people were economically dependent on their ability to raid the sedentary Chinese, and as the Chinese states became stronger and finally united under Qin, the nomads had to form larger groups in response so that they could continue raiding. The second theory claims that while the nomads did raid the Chinese, they were not dependent on them. Being nomads, they led a very frugal lifestyle, and goods they got from the Chinese were luxuries, not necessities. However, this frugality meant fragility, and when a crisis happened, such as the expansion of Mengtian into their land, they were forced to respond. Lewis believes there's truth in both theories, though he finds the second more applicable. While the revenue the nomads gained from raids was important, he says, they were not completely reliant on it. As well as subjugating the other tribes, Maldon led the Xiongnu to retake the lands that had been conquered by Mengtian, the Ordos region, that was encircled by the Great Bend of the Yellow River. At this time, the Chinese Civil War was in full swing, and neither side was concerned with protecting a few outlying regions in the northwest, far removed from the theatres of their own war. Maldon consolidated his forces, and by the time Liu Bang had become emperor, the Xiongnu posed a serious threat. The danger of the Xiongnu was not just that they might invade, but that they might turn the vassal kingdoms against Han. Astutely picks up on a line in the records, which states that a lot of the generals of the Kingdom of Dai had been merchants, and suggests that these men may have maintained trade with the Xiongnu, and were more likely to side with them if push came to shove. He notes that even common people, if they needed to escape the law, felt that they could find sanctuary in the north among the Xiongnu. The Han dynasty was yet to command the loyalty that it would in later years. Indeed, when Maldon launched an attack against one of the vassal kingdoms, a kingdom which was confusingly named Han, in the 9th month of the 6th year, autumn 201 BC, the king of Han, Sin, surrendered his capital Ma Li to them and joined them as a general. His biography in the records portrays the betrayal not so much as out of malice towards Liu or self-interest, but cowardice. In 197 BC, a few years after he had joined the nomads, he was leading a Xiongnu army and was about to engage a Han army. The general of the Han sent a message, urging him to leave the Xiongnu and return. Liu Bang was a forgiving emperor, the general claimed, and would understand that Sin had joined the Xiongnu out of fear. However, Sin refused, believing that his offences against Liu would guarantee his getting punished. He was grateful to Liu for having first made him a king, and felt that, after his betrayal, it would be more than he could expect to be received with open arms. He mournfully recounted his crimes and lamented his situation. Quote, "Now I lurk hidden among the hills and valleys, day and night begging my sustenance from the barbarian tribes. As the cripple does not forget what it was to walk, nor the blind what it was to see, no more am I without thoughts of returning. Only, like them, I no longer have the power." The two armies met in battle, and Sin was defeated and executed. To go back to when the Xiongnu first attacked though, after hearing the news, Liu had quickly organised an army to meet the invaders. He launched his campaign against them in the 10th month of the 7th year, the winter of 201 to 200, leading the army in person. He sent envoys ahead of his army to scout and report back on the strength of the Xiongnu. One of these envoys was Luo Jing, the man who had advised Liu to make his capital in Guangzhong rather than Luoyang. When he came back from the journey, Luo claimed that the Xiongnu were feigning weakness as a trap. He said, quote, "When two states are about to attack each other, it is customary for each to exaggerate and make a show of its superiority. Now, when I journeyed to the Xiongnu, I saw only emaciated animals, old men and boys. It can only be that they deliberately wish to appear inferior and are counting on surprising us with an ambush attack and winning victory. In my opinion, the Xiongnu cannot be attacked." However, Yao Zu didn't believe him and had him arrested. Confidently, he marched out of Guangzhong and headed north to meet the Xiongnu. Maldon cunningly baited the Han army further northward, sending his weakest men against them so that the Han won several skirmishes and continued their advance. But the cold set in, and Liu's men began to suffer from frostbite. The record says that 2 or 3 out of every 10 men lost fingers or toes. Eventually, Liu made it to a mountain called Baidang, near the city Pingcheng, with a vanguard of supposedly 320,000 infantry. Here, Maldon suddenly swept in with his core army, 400,000 riders, and surrounded Liu. Liu's army was cut off from its supply line in the city, and endured the siege of the Xiongnu for 7 days. There are several accounts of how they escaped, and I'll relate them all because they're pretty interesting. The Book of Hands says simply, quote, "He used the secret plan of Chen Ping and succeeded in getting out." Chen Ping was one of Liu's advisors, and was the man behind the plot to break up Xiang Yu and Fan Zheng during the siege of Xinjiang. The record says that this plan to escape the siege of the Xiongnu consisted in sending an envoy to Mao Dun's chief wife, presenting her with gifts, and asking for her to persuade her husband to withdraw. Mao Dun listened to her, also taking into account that reinforcements he had requested from Xin, the King of Han, had not yet arrived. When a section of the encirclement drew back, Liu had his men double-load their crossbows, ready to shoot the Xiongnu should they approach, and marched to the city through the gap in the encirclement. There, they were able to meet up with the rest of the army, and the Xiongnu retreated. The Xin Lun, an essay by the 1st century AD philosopher Huan Tan, elaborates on the idea that there was a secret plan, which had not become common knowledge. Huan Tan wrote that someone asked him about the secret plan, saying, quote, "Chen Ping dissolved the siege at Pingcheng for Gaozu, but it is said that this affair is secret, that the world has not succeeded in hearing what it was. He used workmanship that was marvellous and surpassingly good, hence it was kept hidden and not transmitted. Have you been able, by considering the circumstances, to understand the affair?" Huan Tan denied the idea that it was kept hidden because it had been so potent, and replied, quote, "This stratagem was on the contrary mean, awkward, and evil, hence it was hidden and not reported." He went on to explain that Chen Ping had sent an envoy to Mao Dun's wife, but rather than bribing her as the record says, he warned her that Liu had summoned some beautiful women from his harem and was planning to gift them to Mao Dun, so that he would lift the encirclement. Mao Dun would surely take to these younger, more beautiful women, Chen said, and he would begin to ignore her. It was for this reason that Mao Dun's wife convinced him to retreat. Though he had escaped, Liu could only consider Pingcheng to be a military loss. He made his way back to Guangzhong and left his general Fan Kuai in charge. When Xin, the King of Han, had defected, Liu had set up his own brother, Liu Zhong, as King of Dai. Though Xin had been called King of Han, he actually ruled the more northerly area of Dai. He also set up a man named Chen Si to be the Chancellor of Dai, because he believed Chen Si would be a safeguard to the province. However, the Xiongnu attacked Liu Zhong 2 months after the Battle of Pingcheng, and the new King of Dai fled back to central China. Liu appointed one of his sons to replace him. Chen Si, who remained in Dai, was given total control of the armed forces. This was a bit unusual for someone in the position of Chancellor, but was probably because the new king was still a child. When he was back in Guangzhong, Liu pardoned Luo Jing, the man who had warned him about the Xiongnu trap, and consulted with him about what he should do next. Luo Jing told him that because China was still unstable, they could not beat the Xiongnu in war. Instead, they should seek to pacify them through diplomacy. Luo suggested that Liu should make peace with Mao Dun, and send his eldest daughter as a gift. Liu reluctantly agreed. However, we are told that his wife, the Empress Liu, could not bear to send her only daughter away. Also, she may have already been married to Zhang Yao, one of the vassal kings. So, in the winter of 199-8, about 2 years after the Battle of Pingcheng, Liu sent Luo to escort a commoner girl to Mao Dun, pretending that she was a princess. Luo was worried that Mao Dun would uncover the deception, but apparently he did not. The exchange was the beginning of the He Qin, or harmonious kinship relationship, between China and the Xiongnu. He Qin entailed that the Chinese regularly send gifts of luxuries and princesses to the Xiongnu, that both parties recognise each other as diplomatic equals, and that both parties stick to their side of the Great Wall. On the surface, it looks like China was making a desperate attempt to placate the Xiongnu in the face of failed military action. Boiled down, China was sending a lot of resources to the Xiongnu in exchange for a promise that they wouldn't invade. Even after Luo Jing's visit, the Xiongnu continued to harass China, and it didn't stop more of Liu's followers from turning their backs on the emperor and joining the Xiongnu. The record says that the result of the treaty was merely that, quote, Mao Dun raided the frontier less often than before. However, the Chinese did think that the treaty provided them with some advantages, other than not being attacked. Firstly, the giving of gifts to the Xiongnu could be interpreted not as the tribute of a weaker power to a stronger power, but as an act of magnanimous bounty on behalf of the emperor. More importantly, there was an idea that by tying the family line of the Shan Yu with that of the Han, and by providing the Xiongnu with Chinese luxuries, the Xiongnu would convert to Chinese values and would eventually defer to the emperor. When Lord Jing advised Gaozu to marry his daughter to Mao Dun, he said, quote, "Your Majesty might at various times during the year inquire of Mao Dun's health, and send presents of whatever Han has surplus of, and the Xiongnu lack. At the same time, you could dispatch rhetoricians to begin expounding in a tactful way the principles of etiquette and moral behaviour. As long as Mao Dun is alive, he will always be your son-in-law, and when he dies, your grandson by your daughter will succeed him as Shan Yu. And who ever heard of a grandson trying to treat his grandfather as an equal? Thus, your soldiers need fight no battles, and yet the Xiongnu will gradually become your subjects." This idea, that barbarians could be brought into the fold by exposure to Chinese culture, was not new. When it came to politics, the Chinese had a pretty self-centered worldview, as you'd expect from a society that was far more sophisticated than any other peoples it had knowledge of. They conceptualized the world in 5 different zones. At the center you had the area ruled directly by the king or emperor. Next there were the areas ruled by the feudal lords. Next were the frontier areas that had recently been conquered, and so on. The Xiongnu were considered as belonging to the 5th zone, the most removed from the center. As the zones became further distant from the emperor, the expected level of obligation to the emperor decreased, to the extent that the last 2 zones were basically autonomous. What's important about this theory, though, is that the distinction between what was Chinese and what wasn't was one of gradation, not absolutes, and that zones weren't fixed. Barbarians could become more Chinese, and if they did, then in theory they would be more loyal to the emperor. On another note, the 5 zones theory positioned the emperor as essentially the central, if not the only, pole of authority in the whole world, so the recognition of the Shan Yu as an equal of the emperor was a radical departure from this worldview. I mentioned that after the treaty, some more of those vassals joined the Xiongnu. However, for this episode I'm going to leave relations with the Xiongnu at the establishment of He Qin, and I'll discuss those deserters in the context of the revolts of the other vassal kings. Before getting into that topic though, I'll just briefly mention the other main event of Gaozu's reign, that involved what we might call foreign relations. This was the recognition of Zhao Tuo as king of Nanyue. If you remember from the second episode, the first emperor of Qin had sent armies south to conquer the region inhabited by the Yue people, which corresponds roughly to the area around the Pearl River in the south of modern-day China, and also includes the northern tip of Vietnam. 3 commanderies had been set up in the region. When the rebellion against Qin had broken out, the military commandant of Nanhai Commandery took it upon himself to guard against revolting armies. However, he was sick and on his deathbed, so he appointed a magistrate of one of the counties, Zhao Tuo, to be the new commandant. Instead of merely defending Nanhai, Zhao Tuo took advantage of the chaos and started to fill up the positions in the bureaucracy of Nanhai with his mates. Eventually, he was able to take control of the other 2 southern commanderies as well, and he declared himself King Wu of Nanyue. He pretty much kept out of China's troubles for the remainder of the rebellion against Qin and the duration of the war between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu. When Liu became emperor, he declared that the 3 commanderies of Nanyue belonged to the kingdom of Changsha, one of the vassal kingdoms. However, no effort was made to reclaim them from Zhao Tuo, so it was an insubstantial gesture. Finally, political contact between China and Nanyue was re-established in the summer of 196 BC, near the end of Gaozu's reign, when the emperor confirmed Zhao Tuo in his position. The edict declaring the confirmation displays some classic imperial-style thinking, quoting from the Book of Han. According to the customs of the people of Nanyue, they like to attack each other. At a previous time, the Qin dynasty moved people from the central prefectures to the 3 commanderies on the southern quarter, and sent them to live intermixed with the many tribes of the Yue. It happened that when the world punished the Qin dynasty, the commandery commandant of Nanhai, Zhao Tuo, was living in the southern quarter and ruling it as its chieftain. He has made an excellent arrangement of his government so that the people from the central prefectures have not diminished in number, and the custom of the people of the Yue to attack each other is progressively ceasing. For all the foregoing, the region is in debt to his ability. Now we establish Zhao Tuo as king of Nanyue, and commission Lu Jia to transmit his kingly seal and its cord. The book also says that Zhao paid obeisance to and recognized Gaodi as his overlord, although after Gaozu's death, he actually declared himself emperor of Nanyue, placing himself on the same level as Gaodi's successor. So, this would end up being another rocky relationship. But again, it's something we'll talk about more in future episodes. Now, aside from the Xiongnu invasion, the most important change of Gaozu's reign was the replacement of the kings who had been appointed at his ascension with members of the Liu family. At the start of the Han dynasty, there were 7 kingdoms, each ruled by one of Liu's allies in the war against Xiangnu. 7 years later, at the end of Gaozu's reign, there were 10 kingdoms, 9 of which were ruled by a brother, son, or nephew of the emperor. Only one of the original 7 kings retained his position. A read of the annals of Gaozu portrays the series of usurpations as Liu reacting to disloyal kings, who were caught either plotting or who openly revolted against the emperor. However, most of the contemporary historians I've read consider the replacement of these kings with imperial relatives to have been on some level an active strategy on Gaodi's part. He seized upon the slightest pretext, and punished them upon flimsy evidence so as to staff the kingdoms with those whom he expected to be more loyal. Remember, most of these original kings had fought for Liu out of self-interest. Could they and their descendants be trusted to remain loyal to the Han dynasty? In an ancestor-worshipping, paternalistic culture, shared blood was thought to be a much stronger guarantee of peace. Now, while some of the original kings were certainly disloyal, others were unjustly punished. The traditional sources don't portray the latter cases as malevolence on behalf of Gaozu, but merely mistakes. They tend to take accusations that one of these kings was plotting rebellion as evidence that they were. The first case of revolt happened in the autumn of Gaozu's first year as emperor, 202. This was when Zhang Tu, the king of Yan in the northeast, attacked the region of Dai to his west. Liu led an army himself to fight him. Zhang was defeated after 2 months, captured and executed. Zhang Tu does not have a biography in the records, so we're unsure what his motives for rebellion were. What's important about his case is how Liu responded to it, because in this instance, he did not replace Zhang with a member of his family, but with a man named Lu Wan, who was serving as supreme commander. Lu Wan was in fact a childhood friend of Gaozu's, and benefited from favoritism. When the empire had been established, Gaozu had wanted to make Lu a king, but he was worried that it would arouse jealousy amongst his other followers. When Zhang Tu rebelled, and it became necessary to choose a new king of Yan, Gaozu actually conferred with the other kings and nobles, and asked them to choose someone from amongst his followers, who they thought would be a suitable replacement. However, they knew Gaozu had wanted to make Lu a king, and decided to acquiesce to his wishes. Thus, Lu became king of Yan. I think the revolt of Zhang Tu shows that replacing the original kings with members of his family was not Liu's intent from the start. Though the first new king was a close friend, he wasn't related to Liu in any way. Furthermore, Liu showed a willingness to consult with the other kings, suggesting that he still trusted them and wanted to cooperate with them. Thirdly, Zhang Tu did actually rebel. His arrest and execution were not based on some false accusation. The revolt might have been the event which triggered Liu's concern about the loyalties of the other kings. The next king to lose his spot was Hansen, the king of Chu, not to be confused with Hansen, the king of Han. This was the man whose impressive tactical skill had won the regions of Zhao and Qi during the Civil War. Han seems to have been a victim of false accusation. In the winter of 202-1, an unnamed man simply told Liu that Han was plotting against him. Liu arranged a meeting of the kings, where he planned to arrest Han. This was another suggestion by Chen Ping, the man who later helped Liu escape the Xiongnu. Han, we are told, did not believe he had committed any wrongdoing, but was nervous about the meeting. He actually had an old friend with him in Chu, Zhongli Mo, who had fought on the side of Xiangnu during the war. Han thought he might be able to assure Liu of his loyalty if he turned Zhongli over to him, and approached Zhongli about it. The prospect upset Zhongli, but he nevertheless killed himself so that Han could present Liu with his head. But bringing the head of the wanted man didn't do Han any good. He was arrested, and seems to have been pretty bitter about it. He made a famous statement saying that while he had been useful, he had been befriended, but now that he wasn't needed, he was to be cast away. Quote, "When the cunning hares are dead, the good dog is boiled. When the soaring birds are gone, men put away the good bow. When the enemy states have been defeated, the ministers who plotted their downfall are doomed. The world is now at peace, and so it is fitting that I be boiled." Although he feared the worst, he was not put to death straight away. He managed to convince Liu that he had not been plotting rebellion. Nevertheless, he was demoted to the rank of a marquis. The demotion shook Han, and he began to worry about his future. He confided his fears with Chen Si, the governor of the Zhulu commandery. The two agreed to help each other, in case one or the other revolted against Liu. A few years afterwards, Chen Si was appointed Chancellor of Dai, the kingdom Liu had established to counter the Xiongnu, and he turned against the emperor and joined the nomads. The king of Dai was a young boy, and Chen Si de facto ran the kingdom and its armed forces. After he heard the news, Hansen prepared his marquisate for war. However, someone informed Liu's wife of the agreement between Han and Chen, and she and Xiao He made a scheme to arrest him. They were successful, and he was executed, along with his 3 sets of relatives. When Han was first demoted, his kingdom of Chu was split in two. The northern half was still called Chu, and the southern half was called Jing. The former was given to a nephew of Liu's, and the latter to a brother. Around this time, Liu also established the kingdom of Qi, and gave it to one of his sons. Qi, on the eastern coast, had once been the centre of one of the most powerful of the warring states. During the war against Xiangyu, Liu Bang had granted it to Hansen. However, when Liu became emperor, Hansen was instead made king of Chu, and it seems Qi was divided into commanderies. In the Book of Han, we are given an interesting reason about why this land that had come under the direct control of the emperor should be made into a kingdom. Quote, "Qi is an anciently founded state, but now it has been broken into commanderies with their prefectures. Let it again become a state with nobility." This argument would be used again when Liu established the kingdom of Wu in the winter of 196-5. I wonder if this idea of restoring nobility was something learned from the mistakes of Qin. Remember, Qin had done away with the old feudal families and states, and in the revolution against them, the common people, who had strongly identified with these old families and states, used them as a rallying point against Qin. The record says that, quote, "All the people who spoke the dialect of Qi were to belong to the fief of Qi." This explicit linking of the new kingdom to the shared regional culture might suggest that the creation of the kingdom was a way to appease the quasi-nationalist sentiment that had been the downfall of Qin. In the establishment of Qi, we are also given explicitly the argument for why family members should be made kings. One of the advisors compared Qi's strategic worth to that of Guanzhong or Qin, describing it as a powerful piece of land, which could only be trusted to a relative of the emperor. Quote, "The land of Qin is of superlative configuration, surrounded by natural barriers of rivers and mountains, and stretching 1,000 miles. He who commands an army of 1,000,000 lancers commands 100 times that number if he holds the land of Qin. From such an advantageous stronghold, sending forth troops to subdue the feudal lords is as easy as standing on a roof and pouring down water from a jug. But the land of Qi, too, has its rich fields of Langya and Jimo in the east, the fastness of Mount Tai to the south, in the west the banks of the muddy Yellow River, and in the north the resources of the Gulf of Bohai. Its land stretches for 2,000 miles. He who commands 1,000,000 lancers in this vast area commands 10 times that number when he holds the land of Qi. Therefore, there is a Qin in the east as well as in the west. Only one of the emperor's sons or brothers is fit to be made king of Qi." Chronologically, the next king to be replaced was the other Hansen, the king of Han, but we've already talked about him in the Xiongnu, so let's move on. Zhang Ao, the king of Zhao, was the next to go. Zhang was another king who was unjustly punished. He was in fact Liu's son-in-law, because he had married one of Liu's daughters, the same one Liu had planned to give to Mao Dun. After the Battle of Pingcheng against the Xiongnu, Liu returned to Guangzhong through Zhao and paid Zhang Ao a visit on his way. Zhang felt indebted to Liu, both because of Liu being his father-in-law and because of Liu's role in making Zhang a king. Thus, he treated Liu with an excessive level of deference. However, Liu was known for his uncourtly behaviour, and he, quote, sprawled about and abused Zhang Ao, treating him with utmost contempt. Zhang's ministers, led by the Chancellor, Guan Gao, were ashamed to see him act and be treated in this way. Sure, a king may be below an emperor, but he should still have some dignity. They talked to Zhang Ao and offered to kill Gaodi in revenge. However, Zhang was so distressed by the talk that he bit his finger until it drew blood, and he told them he would have nothing to do with such an improper affair. The ministers apologized for suggesting it. The next winter, Liu was again travelling through Zhao after another season of campaigning against Hansen and the Xiongnu, and Guan Gao and the other ministers, on their own volition, planned to assassinate him at a place called Boren. Before they could make their move, though, Liu got an uneasy feeling and decided not to stay the night. He was getting bad vibes from the name Boren because it was a homophone for the word for a pursued man. Thus, their plot failed. In the winter after that, 199-8, someone informed Liu that Guan Gao and the other ministers had plotted against him. He arrested them all, including Zhang Ao. It seems that Liu was certain of the ministers' guilt, but was unsure about whether Zhang had been involved. Upon their arrest, some of the ministers planned to commit suicide, not wanting to face the punishment that awaited them. However, Guan Gao convinced them not to. If they were all dead, he argued, who would be left to testify their king's innocence? Guan Gao endured terrible torture, and was sentenced to death along with his family. However, he would not betray Zhang and implicate him in the plot against the emperor. Zhang also had the Empress Liu on his side. She did not want to see her daughter's husband severely punished. Thanks to the bravery of Guan and the pleadings of the Empress, Zhang was pardoned of the accusation. In fact, Liu admired Guan's bravery so much that he pardoned him as well. However, Guan felt that he could not accept the Emperor's forgiveness after plotting to kill him, and satisfied that he had saved his king, committed suicide. Though the charges against Zhang were dropped, he was still demoted, being made Marquis of Swanping. He was able to live the rest of his life in peace. Liu Ruyi, one of Gaozu's sons, was made king of Zhao. In fact, Ruyi was already king of Dai. After being transferred to Zhao, another son, Heng, was made king of Dai. The case of the next king, Peng Yue, is a bit unclear. Peng Yue was the king of Liang. In the spring of 196, Liu asked Peng Yue for his help in the campaign against Chen Si, who had by this time revolted. However, Peng Yue declined to join him, saying that he was sick. Against the advice of one of his generals, Peng braved the potential for reprimand and travelled to visit Liu in person at Luoyang to offer his apologies. Liu was annoyed, but decided to let it slide. However, a man who held a grudge against Peng Yue accused him of plotting against Liu, so Liu arrested him. It might look like Peng was wrongfully the victim of some spite. However, we are told that those in charge of the investigation found, quote, full evidence for revolt. Of course, we can be dubious about the objectivity of these investigators, but on the other hand, Chinese courts were fairly sophisticated by ancient world standards. Judges cross-checked different testimonies and collected forensic evidence. A confession was necessary for conviction, and torture would only be used as a last resort. So whether Peng was actually planning revolt or not, we might never know. At first, though, Peng was not sentenced to death. He was demoted from his position as a king, and exiled to Shu, the region in the southwest of China that Liu had ruled as King of Han. On his way, he bumped into the Empress Liu, who was travelling from Luoyang to Chang'an. Weeping, he professed his innocence to her, and asked if he might not be relocated to his hometown instead. Pretending to take pity on him, she agreed to take him back to Luoyang and talk to Liu about it. However, when she got there, she said to the emperor, quote, Peng Yue is a brave man. If you now exile him to Shu, you will only lay yourself open to trouble later on. It would be better to go ahead and execute him. That is why I took the liberty of bringing him with me. Convinced, Liu executed Peng Yue, along with his 3 sets of relatives. In a particularly grisly move, his body was cut up and pickled, with different pieces sent to the other nobles as a warning. As he had done with the kingdom of Chu, Liu split Liang into 2. The western portion became Huaiyang, while the east remained Liang. He made 2 of his sons kings to rule them. We are told in the Book of Han that the question of who should be king was put to the chancellor and the other kings, and that the decision to crown the sons was made at the behest of this council. A similar phrase appears in the accounts of all the subsequent inaugurations. However, no indication of these being decisions made by the ministers and kings appears in the equivalent chapter in the records. I think it's safe to say that even if Gaozu did consult with the others, it was his preference for potential successor that really mattered. If sending pieces of Peng Yue to the other nobles was meant to be a power play to scare the kings into being submissive, it actually had the opposite effect. Qingbu, the king of Huainan, was already fearful because of the execution of Hansen, and after receiving Liu's present, he became convinced that he was next. Deciding it would be better to fight for his life and kingdom, rather than passively wait to be deprived of them, he rebelled a few months later, in the autumn of 196. He was able to maintain a campaign for a few more months, and even succeeded in killing the king of Jing, Liu Jia. However, Gaozu defeated Qing's army in the winter of 196-5, and Qing was captured and executed shortly after. In his final battle against Gaozu, Qingbu professed higher aims than self-preservation. Before the battle had begun, Liu Bang shouted across the field, asking Qing why he had revolted. To this, Qing replied, quote, "I want to be emperor, that is all." The emperor's son Liu Chang was made king of Huainan, and the kingdom of Jing was re-established as the kingdom of Wu, with his nephew Liu Pi as its king. In the fighting against Qingbu, Gaozu was struck by an arrow. He survived, but the injury was linked to him eventually falling into a sickness from which he would never recover. In a nice bit of poetry, the last king to revolt under Gaozu's reign was Lu Wan, the man who had replaced Zhang Tu as king of Yan after the first revolt. Yan was in the northeast, neighbouring the region of Dai, where Chen Si had spent some years fighting Liu's general Fan Kuai. After Chen rebelled, but before he had joined the Xiongnu, Lu Wan had attacked Dai to aid the imperial cause, and he had sent an envoy to the Xiongnu to try and convince them that Chen had already been defeated, so that they wouldn't send help to him. However, when the envoy arrived there, he met the son of the former king of Yan, who had fled from China and was now living among the Xiongnu. The son told the envoy that Lu would be better served taking a more neutral stance on the war in Dai. By this time, several kings had already lost their thrones. If Gaozu defeated Chen Si, then Lu Wan might be next. On the other hand, if Chen Si and the Xiongnu were victorious in Dai, and Lu Wan had been fighting against them, then they might turn on Yan. He concluded, quote, "Why do you not talk the king of Yan into easing his attack on Chen Si and making peace with the barbarians? If things continue to go well for the Han forces, your king can keep his throne in Yan that much longer, while if the Han forces should suffer some sudden upset, his kingdom will not be endangered." When the envoy returned with this suggestion, Lu Wan considered it good advice and held some secret meetings with Chen Si and the Xiongnu, making arrangements in case he was forced to do something drastic. Being a frontier state, many men of Yan already had connections with the nomadic people to the north, so engaging in this sort of diplomacy was not difficult. Lu Wan never ended up joining Chen Si though. Chen was defeated in the winter of 196-5. Unfortunately for Lu Wan though, the fact that he had been having secret meetings with Chen and the Xiongnu came to light, and Gaozu summoned him to Chang'an. Lu was worried and refused on the grounds that he was sick. He said to his ministers, quote, "Of the kings who are not of the Liu family, only I and the king of Changsha are left. In the spring of last year, Hansen and his family were wiped out, and in the summer, Peng Yue was executed. This is all Empress Liu's doing. The emperor these days is ill and entrusts everything to her. Since she is a woman, she thinks only of finding some excuse or other to execute the kings of the other families and the great ministers. Women usually maintained strong links with their birth families even after they were married, and what Lu meant was that the Empress was getting rid of the other noble families in order to put hers in a good position. Whether or not that was a fair judgment of the Empress is something we'll get into next episode. Over the next few months, more people came with reports about Lu Wen's talks with the Xiongnu and Shensi, including Xiongnu fighters who had surrendered. Lu Wen continued to refuse to go to Chang'an. Eventually, in the spring of 195, Gaozu concluded that Lu had rebelled and sent Fan Kuai with an army to Yan. Lu despaired and fled north, where he lived among the Xiongnu. He was treated well, and even made a king by some of the barbarian tribes. However, he longed to return to China, and died an unhappy man after about a year. Fortunately, his wife and children were able to go back to their home country without receiving any punishment. One more of Liu Bang's sons, Liu Jian, was chosen to replace Lu Wen as king of Yan. So, six of the 7 original kings had been replaced by Liu's relatives. I'd like to say a word about Wu Ruwei, the one original king whose family wasn't deprived of the throne. He was the king of Changsha, and he had died shortly after the accession of Liu to the position of emperor, and been succeeded by his son, Wu Chen. It seems Wu Chen never had an inclination to betray Liu, and no accusations were brought against him. I can't say much more than that, because neither of them have biographies in the records. The Wu family for the most part kept their heads down, and in this way held on to the kingdom of Changsha until 157 BC, when the last of their line died without an heir. So, in the end, I think I have to agree with the consensus that Gaozu eventually made replacing the original kings with his family a deliberate policy. However, we did see that the first replacement king was Lu Wan, not a member of the imperial family. It was not until the arrest of Hansen that the argument for crowning family members was made. However, the argument may have swayed Liu so completely that he started actively looking for any misstep he could use to justify the replacement of a king. There are many occasions in the annals where he is presented as passionately holding one point of view, only to be convinced by a single argument to champion the opposing view. Perhaps this is just the way changes of policies are described in the traditional histories, but it could be a real reflection of his character. As more kings lost their place, the others began to suspect that some sort of scheme was afoot, and began to rebel in case they were next. A self-fulfilling death warrant. Now, I said that Liu's efforts to intimidate the remaining kings backfired, but perhaps by the time of Peng Yue's execution, scaring them into desertion was what he wanted, so that he could put his sons on the thrones. It's hard to say. An interesting side effect of the way the standard history format works is that sometimes we lack insight on the motivation of the emperors, the central figures around whom the history is structured. If you talk about it in story-writing terms, the annals sections, which are focused on the emperors, are like the setting or plot outline, while the biographies, which are focused on other important men, are the characterization. If you remember when we talked about Xin, the king of Han, Liu's generals who fought him offered him the chance to leave the Xiongnu and come back to Liu. The general had said, quote, "His Majesty is lenient and kind, even in the case of nobles who have revolted and fled. If they return to him, he has at once restored them to their former positions and titles without inflicting any penalty." Of course, the story of the kings who were arrested doesn't bear this claim out, and when we consider the yet-to-happen fate of the different pieces of Peng Yue, the assessment of the general might seem to be an outright lie. However, and this is just my personal assessment, I do think that Liu Bang earned his reputation for being forgiving. In most ancient civilizations, and China's no exception, treason was one of the worst crimes you could be accused of, and it usually meant death. But all the kings who were arrested on just suspicion, Hansen of Chu, Zhang Ao, and Peng Yue, were, at least initially, merely demoted. Even Guan Gao, the Chancellor of Zhao who had actually tried to assassinate the emperor, was pardoned in respect for his bravery. True, Peng was later executed without provocation, but Han was not executed until 4 years later, when he did actually rebel. Furthermore, even if Liu extended the guilt of the mutineers to their families, he at least did not extend it to their subjects. According to the Book of Han, When Chen Si first revolted, Liu declared that though Chen had betrayed him, quote, "The officials and people of Dai have committed no crime. Those who can leave Chen Si and Wang Huang and come to return their allegiance to me will all be pardoned." The same charity was provided to the people of Yan when Lu Wan was accused. Something to note for future episodes is that while Liu interfered with royal successions in order to secure the loyalty of the kingdoms, he did not seek to disempower the kingdoms as a political unit and deprive them of their autonomy, as later emperors did. In fact, in a few cases he made kingdoms larger by adding territory that had been under imperial control to them. The kingdom of Qi was established on land that had been commanderies, and when Liang was divided into two, each of the new kingdoms was given land that had been part of a commandery. At the beginning of his 7th year as emperor, winter 195 BC, Liu travelled through his home county, Pei, on his way back home from the campaign against Qingbu. It was the first time he had been back to visit since he had set out to fight the good fight against Qin 13 years before. The people of Pei were overwhelmed when they saw the man they had known as a roguish drunkard come to them in the full regalia of the Emperor of China. They had a big party, tinged with a large dollop of nostalgia. The celebrations went on for several days, and Liu worried that his large number of companions would end up eating all the town's food if they stayed much longer. While he was there, he composed a song and taught it to the children of the town and danced to it himself. It went like this. A great wind came forth, the clouds rose on high. Now that my might rules all within the seas, where shall I find brave men to guard the four corners of my land? Of course, its beauty is lost in translation, but it's regarded as a very fine example of Chinese poetry. A few months later, in the spring, Liu became seriously ill from the wound he had suffered in the fighting against Qingbu. His wife, Empress Liu, arranged for a doctor to come and see him. The doctor said that the sickness was treatable, but Liu refused his help. He said, quote, "I began as a commoner, and with my 3-foot sword conquered the world. Was this not the will of heaven? My fate lies with heaven. Even Bian Cui, the most famous doctor of antiquity, could do nothing for me." Thus, he quickly deteriorated. He died on the day Jiachen of the 4th month, the 1st of June, 195 BC. About a month later, he was buried, and his son by Empress Liu, Liu Ying, became emperor. He built a funerary temple for Gaozu in Chang'an, and ordered the other vassal kings to build temples for him in their own capitals. A few years later, he built another temple in Pei, and had their children whom Gaozu had taught the Song of the Great Wind perform the song. With the successful passing of the throne, the installing of Gaozu's other sons as kings, and the establishing of these temples, the progenitor of the imperial line, there is a sense that now the Han dynasty had truly begun. It's funny, we've spent 2 whole episodes centered around the career of Liu Bang, but I've actually had a pretty hard time getting a read on his character. He's received a lot of respect and admiration from traditional sources, but they also portray him as something of a rogue, someone outside the social norms. Throughout his life, he showed a certain disregard for his family. There were the instances last episode where he nearly abandoned his son and daughter while escaping from Xiangyu, and when he refused to surrender even if it meant the death of his father. However, traditional authorities don't usually condemn him for these actions. Rather, they seem to interpret them as a sign that he had his mind fixed on a higher destiny. We are told that when he was a commoner, quote, he always had great ideas and paid little attention to the business the rest of his family was engaged in. He was known for his slovenly behaviour, and though he was praised for rewarding his followers, he was also described as, quote, arrogant and insulting to others. We are told by Ban Gu that he was not a literato. Translator Burton Watson describes Liu Bang and the other early Han emperors as nouveau riches. They had come from a commoner background into immense power and wealth, and did not act with the refinement and elegance of the old aristocratic tradition. Amateur historian Sunny Y. Aoyang notes a bit of a double standard in how Gaozu was not accused of ingratitude by Han Dynasty historians, despite the fact that 6 of the 7 original kings lost their positions under him, while the first emperor of Qin was loathed. even though he did not punish those who had helped him achieve his position, such as Li Si and Meng Tian. Indeed, it seems strange that, considering this, Sima Qian credited Liu with restoring, quote, good faith to governance. However, what seems to have mattered to Sima is the fact that Gaozu was willing to enfeoff people in the first place. We might consider the first emperor's step away from feudalism as a progressive move, but he never articulated it that way. It was not a moral consideration. It was merely a political one. Therefore, his unwillingness to enfeoff people came off as ungrateful from an aristocratic perspective. Sima wrote, quote, after the Qin ruler had assumed the title of emperor, he was fearful lest warfare should continue because of the presence of feudal lords. Therefore, he refused to grant so much as a foot of land in fief, but instead destroyed the fortifications of the principal cities, melted down the lance and arrow points, and ruthlessly wiped out the brave men of the world, hoping thus to ensure the safety of his dynasty for countless generations to come. Yet from the lanes of the common people, there arose a man with the deeds of a king, whose alliances and campaigns of attack surpassed those of the three dynasties of Xia, Shang, and Zhou. Qin's earlier prohibitions against feudalism and the possessions of arms, as it turned out, served only to aid worthy men and remove from their path obstacles that they would otherwise have encountered. We should remember that even if the original kings met a bad end, there are also a ton of men who received enfeoffments as marquises. Historian Michael Lowe estimates that around 150 people had received marquisates by the end of Liu's reign. We are told of one instance where people were being enfeoffed at such a rate that men who fought for Liu were worried that there would literally not be enough land to go around, and were scared that they might be passed over for the slightest fault. To assure them that he intended to reward them all, Liu deliberately enfeoffed a man whom he was known to personally dislike. In the last imperial edict before his death, Liu said, quoting from the Book of Han, "I have been made the son of heaven, and as emperor have now possessed the world for 12 years until the present." He counted his reign from when he had been made king of Han. "Together with the brace officers and talented grandees of the empire, I have subjugated the empire. Together we have pacified and reunited it. Among those of my followers who have distinguished themselves, I have established the best as kings, the next best as marquises, and the least have moreover been given the income of towns. Moreover, some of the relatives of my important subjects have become marquises. All have been themselves authorized to establish their officials and levy taxes. Their daughters have become princesses. The marquises who have the income of towns all wear seals. We have granted them large residences. The officials of the rank of 2,000 pickles we moved to Chang'an to receive small residences. Those who went to Shu and Han and subjugated the 3 parts of the state of Qin are all exempted from taxes and services from generation to generation. Towards the worthy officers and meritorious officials of the empire, I may not be said to have been ungrateful. Let those who unrighteously rebel against the Son of Heaven and arbitrarily raise troops be punished by the united military forces of the empire and be executed." Sure, the fact that the followers who had been established as kings had nearly all been dethroned was admitted. But if you believed that they had been guilty of unrighteously rebelling against the Son of Heaven, then Liu's claim that he had not been ungrateful was basically true. With that, we'll say goodbye to Liu Bang. Next time, we'll cover the reigns of the next few emperors, as well as the regency of Empress Liu, and see how the dynasty dealt with questions of succession and family feuds. One of the questions I'm faced with when I look at the reign of Gaozu is, why was he able to maintain his throne and dynasty while Qin had failed? The Qin dynasty had come crashing down once people started to revolt and mutiny spread across the country. But it seems to me that Gaozu faced more dangerous threats. The rebels that he faced already had whole kingdoms at their command, and what's more, he had to deal with an external enemy, the Xiongnu, who were able to invade China and cause a lot of havoc. Yet, by the end of his reign, the revolts had all been crushed, and a relatively peaceful relationship with the Xiongnu had been established. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any historians tackle this question, so you're just going to have to take my tentative answers. To me, the most obvious difference seems to be the quality of leadership. Whatever Gaozu's faults, he was clearly a capable man. You'd have to be, to go from being a nobody from some innocuous village to Emperor of China. On the other hand, Hu Hai, the second Emperor of Qin, seemed to have been uninterested in government. He was happy to leave things to Zhao Gao, who was more concerned with winning personal control of the court in Xiangyang than in responding to the revolution. On the other hand, Liu was quick to react to every revolt and often led the army himself. Moreover, he had skilled men such as Xiao He and Fan Kuai, who were quite capable of managing the affairs of the empire or leading other campaigns when Liu was off doing something else. The leaders of early Han were often men who had, by their own merits, risen to the top through the anarchy of revolution and war. Under Hu Hai and Zhao Gao, though, those who had helped win the empire, such as Li Si and Meng Tian, were sidelined and executed. My second point of difference is the nature of the revolts. It's a bit hard to tell from the sources, but it seems to me that the rebellion against Qin was a much more popular endeavour, driven by the common people, while the insurrections against Han were led by the elites. Sure, the initial peasant uprising against Qin were often commandeered by dispossessed members of the old noble families, but it seems that the idea of joining up to fight against Qin overlords and restore the original kingdoms remained appealing to the common man. Regarding the revolts of the vassal kings, though, it's unclear how much the people of the kingdoms were willing to back their king if that king decided he wanted to turn against Han. Most of the revolts started because of the king's desire for self-preservation. They didn't articulate a higher goal that could unite people. We've seen that Liu made it clear that he did not blame the subjects for their ruler's actions and guaranteed the safety of anyone who could abandon their mutinous king. If people believed this assurance, they may have felt that they had little reason to follow their king against the emperor. Their self-interested goals also affected the course of the vassal king's rebellions. Despite some nascent efforts at alliances between Hansen and Chen Si, or Lu Wan and Chen Si, and discounting the aid provided by the Xiongnu to some of the kings, the rebellions were fought in isolation. Qingbu, fighting in the south of China, did not coordinate with Chen Si when he was fighting in the north. Lu Wan, though he negotiated with Chen Si, decided on a policy of neutrality and stupidly decided to rebel only once Chen Si had been defeated. In the revolution against Qin, though there were certainly cases of rivalry and backstabbing among the rebels, they remained generally united until they had achieved their common goal of defeating Qin. A third point is that the military might of Qin was concentrated outside of China when the revolt happened, while even though Liu Bang was fighting against a foreign enemy, the Xiongnu, he was doing so within China. Though the Xiongnu Confederacy was a more dangerous foe than the tribes of Yue in the south and the nomads that Qin fought in the north, the fact that Liu was defending China from the Xiongnu, rather than projecting power beyond the frontier, probably meant his campaign was less expensive. Not only that, but the military effort employed against the Xiongnu could be quickly applied to rebellious kings. Anyway, take all that with a grain of salt. I might be completely off the mark with some of these ideas, and maybe I've missed other crucial elements. So that's it for this episode. If you've been enjoying these, I'd appreciate reviews and messages even if you want. You can email me at offspin-history@tutornoda.com. You can visit my website at offspinhistory.wordpress.com. And there's even a YouTube channel because that's where these things are hosted. There's no video, but it's there. And, yeah. I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic, just making these for fun. And yeah, so the next one will come out in 2 weeks' time. And I'd like to thank Shui Shan Yu of Northeastern University for letting me use his music from the album The Vibrant Rhythm of Ancient Heroes.